Welcome back to Only Talk Sports, and tonight we have an interview with Jacob Root of Locked On Hoosiers. Again, really appreciate you for coming on for this interview. I'm sure it's going to be a blast, but definitely cannot wait to get into talking about the Hoosiers in basketball and football because they both have some intriguing-looking seasons coming up in 2023.
Yep, sorry, I had it muted there. Yeah, absolutely, man. It's as an IU grad, it's been a joy to talk IU sports all the time, and now that they're actually good, at least with basketball, it's a lot more fun to talk about IU athletics.
For sure. And I think an interesting question to go into as the first question is talking about the program legend himself, Trayce Jackson-Davis. And I've seen a lot of variance in what people think about him as a player. Obviously, for his skill set, it was very unique. In fact, he did stick around for 4 years, put up the ridiculous stats that he did. But I do see that a lot of the Indiana fan base is very mixed on whether he should be, revered as much at the top of, like I guess you would say maybe the Mount Rushmore of Indiana basketball or whatever, that he's toward the top in that regard. Because, I mean, he's third all time in points. He's first in rebounds, first in blocks. The stats are there, but the winning is not. So I think, in the future, when people look back at Trayce Jackson-Davis, again, it's going to be very interesting, the difference in opinions on him. How much of a legacy, basically, do you think that Trayce Jackson-Davis left in Indiana? Do you feel like he's done enough to be, I guess, thought of very highly by the Indiana fan base in the future?
Yeah, it's an interesting debate. I kind of had a couple times where I guess it comes down to what you value as a basketball fan or as an IU fan. If it's winning in terms of a team context, yeah, he kind of falls short there because of, I mean, things that were really out of his control. The Archie Miller era, it was what it was. It wasn't pretty. And when they switched gears and went with Mike Woodson, he was doing everything he could individually to help that team to victories. Because on an individual stance and statistically, you're probably not going to see anybody better than him in our lifetime. And if we are, we're going to be blessed because he, for all the where he landed in all the all-time leaderboards, as you just said, that's a kind of a once in a generation type of player. So to me, he's up there with among the all-time greats. It's a very short list of guys that I think he belongs with, whoever that may be as a personal preference. But I absolutely think he is one of the best. If you want to hold the lack of team success against him, fair enough, but he did all he could in that regard. And I don't think, it's not like he was struggling in the biggest games. He was routinely showing up in all the biggest moments. So to me, he's one of the all-time greats. And that's what I was kind of preaching last season. Enjoy him while he was here, because you're not going to see someone like him probably ever again.
100%. Especially with the way, sports are going now with players, more of them are transferring out for a year or two. There's just, the stats aren't going to be there. But I agree 100% as well with the statement that, depending on the way that people think about him, most will say that he's going to be highly regarded, but still there'll be a small faction of the fan base that does not. And I think that a lot of it is going to hinge on whether Indiana starts, consistently winning again, because he might be seen as the guy that helped bring Indiana back. And if Indiana kind of flounders again and starts to struggle again, then he'll be probably thought of as, that brief blip that they were a bit better, that he kind of made them decent, but then they weren't very good again. So unfortunately, I do think his legacy will be kind of determined based on how they keep doing in the future, but I don't think that should be the case at all, because based on what he's done, he is a program legend. And like you said as well, I mean, he did not have the players around him to really help him in that regard. I mean, he even said it himself, Jalen Hood-Schifino and even Xavier Johnson, to that, for that matter, were both some of the best players he ever had to play with at the guard position to help him out. And I mean, he didn't have that in the Archie Miller era. And you talk about some of the other greats Indiana had, like Calvert Chaney and Isaiah Thomas and Scott May. Those guys had a lot of help. Those guys got tons of help. Some of their teammates were great players in their own right. Jackson-Davis did not have that. So I definitely do not think that it would be fair to knock that against him. He is a fantastic player and definitely will be remembered in my mind, as an Indiana Hoosier for a long time. Now, I think as for the next question is, you mentioned the transition from Archie Miller to Mike Woodson, how important that is because Indiana has been doing a better job lately with him. What do you think the pulse is on the IU fan base of how Mike Woodson is doing? Is he like blowing their expectations out of the water? Has he kind of done about what people thought, or is he, underperformed based on what people were expecting him to do so far at Indiana?
I don't know that there's any other way to frame it other than just a complete success so far. I was one of those that was very skeptical about his hiring. I wasn't certain that they did a great job kind of casting a wide enough net and talking to enough people. And then I had concerns about Mike Woodson himself in that, I mean, he's older. He's someone who didn't have any sort of college basketball experience. And there's certain things you got to have to adapt to in the college game. Recruiting was big amongst them. And I was wrong about all of it. Like, he's knocked it all out of the park. He has been incredible from the moment he stepped on campus. And I mean, to that point, getting Trayce Jackson-Davis to stick around and potentially be that foundation that he can build the program on has been enormous. And then it's going to be interesting now because I think expectations are changing with him. That first season, certainly nobody had a clue what to expect. And for him to get him back to the tournament was fantastic. Last season, you can write off a certain degree of injuries and that leading to them underperforming a bit. But now he's going to have, I think, a lot more expectation. There's been plenty of talk about him changing the way Indiana is going to play moving forward. And so now he's going to, I don't want to say the honeymoon period is over necessarily, but he's kind of set a really high bar for what to expect from this program under him now. And he's going to have to continually meet that bar. Now, I there's no reason to believe that he won't do that. And he's continuing to bring in incredibly talented players and top recruits and things like that. So I'm still confident in that he can do it. But about this time 2 years ago, I had a lot of questions about Mike Woodson. And now I sit here ecstatic that he came back to Bloomington because it has been fantastic these last 2 years having him around.
Yeah, I think it's a interesting point you bring up about with Mike Woodson. You didn't know what to expect, and because I remember when he got hired, and I mean there was a lot of speculation. I remember the Brad Stevens rumors and all that. I mean that wasn't likely at all. And I even saw Chris Beard. I was even seeing Porter Moser, but some people were saying that would be Archie Miller 2.0. Who knows on that regard because obviously wasn't hired, so we won't know how that would have worked. But Mike Woodson was definitely out of left field. It wasn't expected at all. And, he has so much coaching experience, more than a lot of people, I think, realize in the fact that he was an NBA coach for 10 years. He was an assistant coach for, the other 20 years. So he's been in the NBA as a coach for like 30 years. He played, obviously. So he's got like 4 decades of NBA experience. So in that regard, I mean, he's a great hire, but he didn't have college experience in coaching at all. So, like, that's what made him wouldn't say a red flag, but just more of a mystery. How is he going to do? But I do think that he has, like you said, it's been a success. He's overperformed, but now the bar has been raised. And if he can't meet the expectation or keep, moving up or having Indiana keep improving, it could create some, friction with the fan base if he can't continue to have Indiana go in the right direction. But I think so far he has done a really solid job to your point. Now, the next question about Mike Woodson and what he's done in Indiana basketball. Have they returned to national relevance? And I know that doesn't really matter because of the fact that at the end of the day, the media is going to talk about who they want to talk about the most. But do you feel like Indiana has returned to national relevance?
It's a interesting debate. I think they're probably on the fringes of it right now. Last season was set up, I think, in a way where if they had met expectations, they probably would return to that conversation. To me, it's your Dukes, your Kansases, your Gonzagas, UNCs, schools like that are kind of the inner circle right now. And there's programs that'll shuffle in and out of that and whatnot. But that to me is kind of the group that Indiana needs to pull itself towards. In some ways, they're doing that. I certainly think on the recruiting trail, they're absolutely doing that, and they're getting in. Not even just getting in the door; they're actively being considered by top recruits, which is a huge win for Mike Woodson and that coaching staff. So in that regard, they're nationally relevant, I guess, but you have to turn that into on-court success as well. And if you bring in enough of those top recruits, eventually that'll happen. But I would say they're probably on the fringes right now. They're certainly a lot more relevant than they were at the end of the Archie Miller era. I don't know that. I mean, I don't even know they were Big Ten relevant at that point. They were struggling mightily at the end of that. And Mike Woodson has brought them back to being a program that is respected at the very least, which I don't know that was the case a couple years ago. And he certainly is building something here. It feels like there's another step they're going to need to take to get to nationally relevant. It probably includes winning a Big Ten title, whether probably a regular season one. I don't know how much people care about a Big Ten conference tournament. So there's probably another step there they need to make or make a deep run in the tournament, but they're more respected and they have a better reputation nationally. Does that make them relevant? I guess, again, it's kind of subjective, but I would say they're probably on the fringes right now.
That makes sense. I mean, Indiana was really close to winning the Big Ten last year. I mean, they were, like you said, an injury that hurt, especially with Xavier Johnson, and then Race Thompson got banged up for a stretch there. I mean, they had like 3 or 4 games they lost by like a couple points last season. And if they win those games, they win the Big Ten. They were very close. They swept Purdue. So when they were at their best, they were the best team in the Big Ten last season at their best, but they just weren't healthy. And sometimes even when they were, they didn't play, elite basketball. But when they were healthy beginning of the season, they beat Xavier on the road. They beat North Carolina in the Big Ten ACC Challenge. Rest in peace of that. But I mean, I think that overall, Indiana definitely was a really good team last year. There's just a small way away from being a lot better than they were, and that would have definitely helped in the national relevance regard. But it is what it is. Can't go back. Definitely the future is going to be, I guess you would say, decisive in making Indiana nationally relevant again. And that starts with the next season's Hoosiers. And this question, I have no idea how you're going to answer this question, so it's going to be really interesting who you pick. But for next season's team, obviously last year you could you make an argument Trayce Jackson-Davis by far was the most important player. But for this year's team, who do you think is the most important player for Indiana basketball next season in determining their success next year?
Most important is an interesting way to phrase it, because I think there's 2 names that come up. Khalil Ware would be one of them. And I spoke about this recently on the podcast. If Indiana is going to win a Big Ten title, like we were kind of discussing, he's going to have a really big season. But to me, I think most important is going to be Xavier Johnson, because there's a lot of things Indiana doesn't have. They don't have a ton of experience. They have only a couple point guards, and he's one of them. And they don't really have that kind of leader, that on-court leader as much. They lost that with Trayce and Race and Miller Kopp. And Xavier Johnson represents all of those things. And even when Trayce was here, this team largely went as Xavier Johnson went the last couple of seasons. When he played well, Indiana tended to play really well. And when he struggled, Indiana tended to struggle. I think that's going to be amplified this year with how important he's going to be to the team, but also the way Indiana is going to play. If they're spreading things out and the ball's going to be in his hands more, and you're running some more pick and rolls and driving kicks and things like that, there's a lot of responsibility. and pressure on him and expectation on him to play well. I think he's certainly capable of it, but the Xavier Johnson ride has been a roller coaster at times during his, well, not at times, basically the whole time he's been at IU. So I expect there to be some more up and downs, but I do think he's probably the most important player on this team next season.
That makes sense. I mean, Xavier Johnson's been a very interesting player anyway, for me, watching college basketball last 4 or 5 years and him, being a part of it. I remember when he was at Pitt, he had a season in his freshman year. He had like 14, 15 points per game. I mean, he was on NBA draft radars and stuff like that. So, I mean, he's a guy that has a lot of talent. Granted, Pitt did not have as many good players around him as, he still has in Indiana. And that's why he scored more. But he is definitely a guy capable of taking over a game, relatively speaking, not completely, but he can certainly add to that. But like you said, he is mightily inconsistent. And sometimes, like that one game, I think it was in 2021 against Wisconsin, where he was like 1 of 13, shooting in that game. He just could not make a shot, and Indiana collapsed because they were winning that game by like 20. And then they ended up losing in the second half in the Kohl Center, which they still haven't won there since 98, which is insane. But I think that overall, looking at Xavier Johnson, like you said, if Indiana is going to have a really good season next year, he has to play well most nights. It is definitely, a must-have for sure. I think that, like you said, Khalil Ware, I think McKenzie and Baco, those guys are going to be really important, but a lot of their success will be determined on how Xavier Johnson plays, which makes 110% for sure. I think that another interesting question about the roster before we, start talking about how you think they're going to do next season, but do you think that CJ Gunn or Caleb Banks next year has a bigger likelihood of breaking out and having more success next season?
Right now, I would say I wouldn't be surprised. I think both of them will have some role. I would say CJ Gunn mainly because of opportunity. I don't know. I mean, right now, IU's guard rotation is kind of a big question mark. You have Trey Galloway, you have Xavier Johnson, you have Gabe Cupps as the backup point guard. I'm not sure who the backup shooting guard is right now, which it could be CJ Gunn. Ja'Kai Newton could be. It sounds like his knee injury is probably going to limit him quite a bit this summer. So I would say he's going to be starting behind the 8 ball. I think there's going to be a lot of opportunity for CJ Gunn early on to take a step forward and be that guy. Because of that, I think I wouldn't be surprised if he played a pretty decent sized role this season. What I would say as well is that the new kind of way this offense is going to look, relying more on athleticism, getting guys into space, things like that, that really suits Caleb Banks as well. So I think both of them very much could have kind of breakout sophomore seasons, but I would say it's probably more likely for CJ Gunn, if only because I think the opportunity is going to be there more.
Yeah, 100%. Because the backcourt, is a bit thin, like you said. I mean, I was a bit shocked that Indiana did not fill that spot because they only have one roster spot available. They have 12 spots, and Mike Woodson did a phenomenal job filling up this roster with talented players. But I think that it is interesting that spot didn't get filled. Do you think it's more likely that that spot did not get filled because Mike Woodson's leaving that spot for the 2024 class, or do you think that he just wasn't able to get a guy that fit the system or something like that?
It's probably the latter. I think that there were specific guys, I guess, that you target. You don't go out there and say, "Oh, you're a guard, come in," because there's all kinds of dynamics, obviously, at work. But I think that there were players they were looking at, and they turned the Hoosiers down, and the transfer portal moves so quickly that you might be focusing on a guy over here, and somebody you thought was plan B over here commits. And suddenly, if you lose out on plan A, plan B isn't there, then you got to figure out a plan C. And I think that's just kind of the way things panned out for Mike Woodson and the staff. I was a little surprised that they didn't get anybody, and there's certainly some time. I would be surprised if they went into the season with nobody in that spot. But I mean, as you said, I guess the added benefit is it's an extra scholarship you can offer to the 2024 class, which IU is doing a ton of work in and are in the mix with a number of the top guys in that class. So maybe it works out in the long run. But I would say that it's a guard that they probably would have certainly they were targeting with that last scholarship spot, which would kind of answer some of those questions, even with CJ Gunn. And even if you think he is set for a breakout season and a bigger role, that's really 4 guards. Ja'Kai Newton, depending on what his availability is going to be, 4.5, 5 guards that you have on the roster. It's not a lot. And so it does leave IU a little shorthanded. And if injuries come up again, which knock on wood, but it's been a recurring thing the last couple seasons, if injuries come up again, it leaves you in a bit of a pinch. So that's why I also think that there is probably somebody that they'll bring in, but I certainly don't think the plan was to leave that spot open.
Yeah, it makes 100% of sense. I mean, because the roster is very thin. I mean, you got Anthony Leal as well. I know a lot of Indiana fans talk about him, and he is a fantastic representative of the university, but he just never has broken out to the point of playing significant minutes. He had that one game against Wisconsin where he had 9 points, but outside of that, in his freshman year, he just has not contributed a lot. If he doesn't, is not able to contribute this year much as well, then, I mean, like you said, I do think Indiana needs to fill that spot. And there's still guys out there. I mean, it's crazy. It's a lot, almost August, and there's still a few guys out there, but that will be interesting for sure. But, we talked about the roster. We talked about how Mike Woodson is doing. So based on everything that you've seen with the roster so far, and obviously it is impossible to be able to project how, they're going to do exactly next season because injuries could happen, or maybe the talent just doesn't mesh together as well as we think it will. Do you think that Indiana will more than likely make the tournament next season? And do you think that they have a shot of being able to win the Big Ten next year? Or do you think that there's no chance at all?
I wouldn't say no chance. I think this team has a lot of questions, and it's going to be really interesting to see what the first couple of weeks, what some of those games against Kansas and Auburn and some of those bigger games they have scheduled, what the team looks like. Tournament, I feel like, is like that's like a bar you have to clear at this point. Big Ten title contention, Michigan State's really good. Like, and Purdue, as long as whatever 7-footer they have it this time around is there, they're going to be good. So those two teams are going to be solid. Indiana could be that good, but there's just so many unknowns with this team this season. As much roster turnover as you had, I mean, when Indiana at the end of the season was playing tournament games and playing must-win games, they were playing 7 guys and 5 of them are gone. So there's just so many questions with this team that I'm not really sure what to expect from them. There's a lot of variance. I could see it going really well, and maybe they are competing for a Big Ten title, but I could see it also struggling and IU fighting to try to get into the tournament. So I'm not really sure what to make of this team. I'm excited to see what it's going to look like because I think if it does go well, it's going to be an exciting brand of basketball with a lot of really good players. IU probably should have 1, if not 2 more first-round picks on the team this season. So a lot of talented players. It's going to be fun to watch. Will it be fun to watch and successful? I guess we'll find out. But there's just so many questions with this team heading into this season.
Yeah, I think it's interesting because of the fact that with Indiana, when Trayce Jackson-Davis finally was ultimately going to leave, I always felt like Indiana was, especially when Mike Woodson took over, it was going to be a big shift, a big transition over to the guards being the main focus. And it's like this year's team just is not that because Khalil Ware, because, Malik Renew, because Mackenzie Mbaka, they're all forwards and centers, with Khalil Ware. And Malik Renew if you classify him as a center. It's just unbelievable that that's like still the main focus this year. I was kind of shocked that the roster ended up shaking out that way. But still, like you said, a lot of talent, but talent does not always equate to success. It's going to be really interesting to see. Hopefully Indiana does do really well in basketball, but I would agree with you that I think they should make the tournament. But it'll be interesting how good they actually are. Last basketball question, because of the fact I did see a while back that Kentucky and Indiana could have returned in 2025. I don't know if that's been confirmed completely or not, but
hasn't yet.
So it hasn't been confirmed yet. But do you think that Indiana and Kentucky basketball will return in the next few years? And do you think that the majority of the fan base still wants this game? Because I know back after the Watt shot, it was unanimous. Everyone still wanted to play Indiana, Kentucky, the game every single year. But I think I've seen more people that say they don't care anymore. Like, it just doesn't really matter. Do you think the majority of the fan base still wants the game? And do you think it will happen soon?
I'm going to be honest. I kind of forgot that it was a thing until you mentioned it. It was a storyline, quite a big one last off season. I do think it'll happen because, I mean, Mike Woodson and Calipari both came out and said that they want it to happen. And if both those guys want it, I'd be shocked if it doesn't happen. Do fans want it? Probably. There might be some uncertainty about it now, but play that first game. Get the blood boiling again, and everybody's going to want that rivalry back. I wish it was going to be played at campuses. I would be surprised if it is. That's just the silly line in the sand that John Calipari draws with every non-conference game, basically. I don't like that part, but at this point, I would rather play them at a neutral site, whether Indianapolis, whether Louisville, whatever it is. I'd rather play them at a neutral site than not play them at all. It's a fun rivalry. I enjoy having the bragging rights over them, and which is the best part about rivalries. So I think it'll happen. And whether fans are apathetic toward it now or not, after that first game, everybody's going to love it and want to continue playing that rivalry and that series on and on.
I mean, Indiana, Kentucky, I know a lot of fans. I mean, that's like the true rivalry. It's not even Indiana, Purdue, even though it's technically their official rival is in state and it's in conference. But like Indiana, Kentucky, for a lot of people, is the rivalry. And I mean, the football rivalry hasn't happened in a long time. The Bourbon Barrel's been gone for almost 2 decades now. The basketball team hasn't played, officially in the regular season since 2011. I even heard rumblings that the baseball, series stuff's going to quit as well. So it's like Indiana, Kentucky just is not playing each other, and it's like they should. I mean, they're two border teams, and they have a lot of history and a lot of classic games, especially in basketball. So I think it should return as well, but it's crazy how it has not been the case recently. So I guess moving on to the football team really quick, I think that Indiana football, they've got a lot of question marks. Will they make a bowl game? Will they actually have a team that can even possibly get there? It's going to be really interesting. But I think to start out, because they start their season with Ohio State, with the Buckeyes, which is the absolute worst team you could possibly, start with if you look at it from the mindset that you're playing your toughest opponent in week 1, and you could get just completely obliterated and lose your confidence, and it can ruin the rest of your season. Or maybe, Indiana could play them slightly tough because it's Ohio State's first game, because they have question marks at quarterback. Maybe Indiana can gain some confidence if they give them a close game. Do you think that starting the season with Ohio State this year will help or hurt Indiana football at the end of the day or at the end of the season?
Man, I really despise having those conference games at the beginning of the season. I was trying to look back to the last time it happened. They finished 5-7 that season. I don't know how much it's going to dictate anything about Indiana's season. I know Tom Allen doesn't like it either. He spoke at Media Day last year and said he didn't like it, and he also said it seems to happen more to Indiana playing a Big Ten game than anyone else. It's not entirely random. Thank God that we're going away with the divisions after this season and getting rid of the Big Ten East. It's not great, I'll say that. Like, you want to come out, you want to build some confidence with the non-conference schedule. You want to feel good about yourself to start off the season, and having to play Ohio State in week 1, you're not going to come away from that game probably feeling all that great. So I don't love it in general, regardless of who it is they play, whether it's Ohio State, whether it's Illinois, whether it's whoever it's been in throughout the year, the Penn State, although that was a COVID year, so it was only conference games. But whoever it's been, I haven't really enjoyed it, but I don't know that it's going to dictate too much. IU's not beating Ohio State. I mean, even when they had their best season, they didn't beat Ohio State. So, like, I think this coaching staff is probably used to playing these conference games early on, and they can get teams ready and have them have the right mindset for these games as well. Because, as you said, if they're going to go to a bowl game, you're not counting the Ohio State game as a win or even a possible win, really. So you kind of play that game and then have to throw that away and then go in a non-conference play. We'll see how it pans out. I mean, maybe you start with you kind of said one of your toughest opponent of the season, get them out of the way at the beginning of the year, and then there's a severe drop in, I guess, talent level, to be frank, and when the next couple of games come around. So you could spin it into positives. I just really do not like playing conference games early on, and especially when it's multiple times now been Ohio State that they're playing.
Yeah, I think that in general, I know why, college football and even, you have college basketball with the Champions Classic kind of deal, stuff like that to start the season. But in college football especially, you have these massive games. You've had Georgia Clemson week 1. Last year you had Utah Florida, all these big games. And that's great because it gets people just back into college football. And that's awesome, but these teams aren't ready to play each other yet. I mean, I remember the Georgia Clemson game especially. That game was like 10-3. And Georgia beat Clemson, and there was a lot of people saying, "Oh, neither team's good at offense." Well, it ended up being that Clemson wasn't that good at offense that year, but Georgia ended up obliterating everybody and winning the title. So that's not an indication of how good you really are. I mean, Ohio State struggled with Minnesota last year in week 1. And then Ohio State ends up being way better than Minnesota. It's a week 1 game. I just don't think, despite, yes, it draws eyeballs in week 1 and gets people back into college football with these massive games they can headline. I just don't think it's good for these teams and these players to start their seasons like this. It's much better to play easy opponents and then build up, and get used to playing together on the field and then playing these tougher games. But that's just not the way it is, but I just don't think it's good at all whatsoever. But now we talked about Mike Woodson. He's in pretty good standings right now with the Indiana basketball fan base. Tom Allen, not so much. If we were doing this 3 years ago, I mean, he was getting a contract extension after the 2020 season. Everything was looking great for him. Tom Allen's a guy I really, root for because of the fact he's just, his LEO mantra is, his personality. I mean, he even chipped his tooth on Devon Monster Matthews' helmet because of the fact he was so excited in that one game. I mean, he is just a really fun guy and, a guy that a lot of players really like to play for. But he's lost a lot of that goodwill, and I do know that the Indiana fan base, despite the fact they know that Indiana football struggles to win, it's kind of getting to the point where he is on the hot seat for sure. And, it's not looking good in any way, shape, or form, despite the fact that he does have a still fairly large buyout. Obviously his security is not in great shape, but what do you think Indiana has to go this season for him to keep his job? Or do you think that, like, no matter what he does this year, he'll still last another season?
I would say with probably 80% certainty, he'll still last because it's not till after next season that his buyout drops. And that's the only reason why at this point is because his buyout is as high as it is. It's hard to say. Trying to set expectations for IU football is such a challenge because you could say, like, oh, go to a bowl game and that'll save your job. But, like, even when IU was quote unquote good, like, a bowl game was still a big deal. So I said last year that I just wanted to see kind of progress.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know that we really saw that. If not for just that super bizarre win against Michigan State at the end of the season, you were going to end the year on a really, really bad, long losing streak yet again. So I don't want to entirely write that game off because it is something to have the team still motivated to win that game against a Michigan State team that needed to win to earn a bowl bid, and they didn't because losing that IU game. So it's something to still have the team motivated in that regard, and that is, there was some progress there because the year prior I thought the team gave up and let go of the rope, and just it got really ugly at the end of the season. It wasn't as much the case last year, and until Dexter Williams' injury in the Purdue game, they were right there, and it was shaping up to be a really fun game. So the progress they showed, though, wasn't really tangible.
Mm-hmm.
You probably need some tangible progress this season. I don't want to set the bar at bowl game, but you need a 4 or 5 win season, I think, at the minimum. Probably even better than that. Maybe 5 wins is really where you have to set the benchmark, because he's lost all the momentum with this program right now, and it's really hard to build that up. And if you keep stacking up 3-win, 4-win seasons, guys are going to leave the program and go elsewhere in the transfer portal era, and then it becomes even harder to build any sort of a program because you're having to constantly replace players. So IU football is kind of in a rough spot in the modern era of college athletics because of the transfer portal. It adds pressure to them needing to be competitive and win. And that just, I mean, Indiana with any sort of expectation when it comes to the football program is falling flat on its face basically every time. So they're in a really tough spot right now. I would say probably a 4 or 5 win season is probably kind of the benchmark, and anything over that is a great success. I mean, over that, and you're going to a bowl game, and that would be huge, I think, for IU this season. So they're in a weird spot right now. It's not a great place to be with IU football right now.
Yeah, it's definitely not. I mean, that Michigan State game was important because, like you said, Indiana would have been losing 9 games in a row. That would have been awful, starting 3-0 and then going 0-9. So that game, they definitely needed to have it, some type of success. And I mean, Dexter Williams he played really good in that game, despite the fact that he only threw for like 20 yards. I mean, Indiana does not win that game if Connor Bazelak's a quarterback. And it's nothing against him at all, because he is solid, but he was the absolute worst quarterback that Indiana could possibly have, because their offensive line is a problem. They just have not had good offensive line play since probably early Tom Allen era. They were okay then. They were getting guys to the NFL on a regularity, and most of those were Kevin Wilson guys. And recently they've been awful, the offensive line. And Connor Bazelak was just a standstill quarterback, pocket passer, and it wasn't a good fit. I remember when he transferred, I was like, I just don't think this is going to work because he doesn't have mobility, and Indiana's O-line is not that great. But Dexter Williams, I mean, he provided a spark. Like you said, if he didn't get hurt against Purdue, I'm not saying they'd have won that game, but they would have had a much better shot, and they probably would have been able to beat Rutgers and Maryland as well if he was running the football like that, if he was playing and didn't get hurt. Indiana had something going there. But, I mean, that brings us now to this year's, group of quarterbacks, because Dexter Williams is still on the shelf. We don't know when he's going to return. It could be mid-season. But you've got Tayven Jackson, the younger brother of Trayce Jackson-Davis, the program legend. It's still just is wild to me. You've got Trayce Jackson-Davis basketball. Now Tayven Jackson has a shot to make, something special happen in Indiana football. It'd be crazy if they could both do that at Indiana basketball and football. But he's going up against Brendan Sorsby, who did play a little bit last season against Penn State, was not very successful. And can't really expect a true freshman to have success there. Do you think that it's a legitimate quarterback battle between the two? Or do you think Tayven Jackson has the job, in your opinion, pretty much locked up based on his pedigree as a high school recruit, and he's, has a little more, I guess you would say his stats look better at Tennessee than Sorsby did in Indiana last year? And if so, do you think that Tayven Jackson is being slept on as a, quarterback in the Big Ten next year? You think he can surprise some people?
I would say Tayven is the front runner at the very least. One of the things I always go back on is guys don't transfer to a school without having some sort of assurances. I don't know that Tom Allen said you're the starting quarterback, but he probably came in and said, hey, you have a good fall, a good spring, a good fall, you're the quarterback. And so I imagine I would be really surprised if he was not the starting quarterback this season. And so now we're not going to know that until the first snap of the Ohio State game with the way Tom Allen does things. But he's really talented. I on the show back when Tayven committed during basketball season, we had on our football recruiting expert to talk about who Tayven was coming out of high school. And he said he spoke to people at Tennessee. Tayven was being groomed to be the guy at Tennessee after Hendon Hooker got injured and was eventually going to leave. He was being prepped to play in the bowl game for Tennessee, and then they sat him out because he had a little bit of an injury and they just didn't want to risk anything. They wanted him to head into spring and fall practice healthy, and then they recruited over him, and which is the nature of college football. And Tayven saw that and probably talked to some people at IU and realized the opportunity there and left to go to IU. But I say that to tell just how good Tayven Jackson is, and that's a kind of a blue blood program for college football that was ready to make him the next guy. And so he's going to come into IU with a lot of talent. There's still going to be a lot of questions, and there's only so much one man can do. And as you were kind of saying, if the offensive line struggles as it has in recent years, it's going to severely limit what Indiana can do. But he's a super talented player, a great athlete that's going to be able to make plays even if IU's offensive line struggles. I'm really excited to see what he can do this season. I think him and Jalen Lucas together are going to be a ton of fun this season. And so at the same time, he's still really young, redshirt freshman. Maybe he's being slept on a little bit, but he's going to have growing pains. And your hope is that there's a lot more positive flashes than negative ones this season. But if things work out, IU has maybe their guy moving forward with, as a redshirt freshman, you would have him for a number of seasons, assuming, knock on wood, he doesn't transfer, which I would be surprised given the legacy the family has at IU. But I'm really excited to see what he does this season, because he was a super talented recruit and someone that was being set up to play for Tennessee. And if you'd tell me that IU was going to get Tennessee starting quarterback almost every time, I'd be excited for it. So he's going to be a lot of fun to watch this year, I think.
Yeah, I think that how he plays has a big effect on how successful Indiana could be, because no one's talking about him. That's why I think he's being slept on. And you are 100% correct. He's only a redshirt freshman, and he has very little experience at all. And Indiana's offensive line, despite having a new offensive line coach in Bob Bostad from Wisconsin, if he could make the O-line a little bit better, and if he does, then that maybe could help Tayven Jackson out big time. But, I think I saw, quarterback rankings in the Big Ten, and Tayven Jackson was, second to last or last. And, granted, most of the guys ahead of him have more experience, so that makes sense in a ranking. But I just feel like he has a chance to be really good. And if he is good, that could make Indiana much better than people are expecting, than 3 or 4 wins that are what basically the betting lines are for their over under the season. So it's gonna be really interesting, but I think that he has a shot to be really solid. And you mentioned another player. That was my next question, was Jalen Lucas, because a lot of people were expecting him to hit the portal, Dasan McCullough. and some other guys Indiana lost, but he stayed. So he was a freshman and he had a phenomenal year despite very limited usage. I mean, he had 2 return for touchdowns. He was good in the ground game, had some pretty good receptions as well, had the most all-purpose yards for an Indiana player since Walt Phillier, and he got All-American awards for his kick returning and everything. So, I mean, he's got a lot of accolades already. 3-star recruit out of Louisiana, a slept-on guy that was committed to Tulane. I mean, it's one of those situations where for him having that big year in Indiana, I could definitely have saw him leaving to go to a bigger program. But he stuck around in Indiana. How much more do you think that he'll be used this year versus last year? And do you think, I know I basically asked, the most important player for IU, do you think Jalen Lucas will be the most important player for Indiana football next year, or whether it's Tayven Jackson or someone else?
Jalen Lucas is someone that even last year during fall camp, this coaching staff was talking a lot about, and he was kind of an overlooked recruit, as you said. He had committed to Tulane originally, and IU was able to snag him. And he always jumped off the paper and jumped off the tape and whatever cliche you want to use with his athleticism and speed. And he showed that last season. I think a lot of IU fans were rightfully frustrated with how little he was used in an offense that was anemic for a lot of the season and just really lifeless for much of the year. So it was nice to see him later in the year get more usage and turn that into more big plays. And I think one of the things Indiana's offense has lacked since probably the COVID year is explosiveness. There's no big playability with this offense the last couple of seasons, and part of that's because big plays typically come in the way of a big pass downfield, and IU couldn't stay in the pocket that long, or breaking open a big hole for a run, and IU's offensive line wasn't doing that. And so it was nice to see him make the most out of the opportunities he had last season. He's going to be a really big factor in this team, and they've already said as much, and I expect he'll to be all over the field. He'll be a running back. I would imagine he's going to be in the slot some. He's going to be all over the place, I think, this season, because I think they realize just get the ball in his hands and good things happen. Is he the most important player? It's really hard to pick one in football, especially with this IU team, because you could pick any. The most important thing is going to be the offensive line. So, there's not any one of those guys necessarily that jumps off the table, but if the offensive line continues to play as it has the last 2 seasons, it doesn't matter how much fun Jalen Lucas looks like and how underrated Tayven Jackson might be. They're not going to be good because of that offensive line. Now, if you were to tell me you're going to get an average offensive line and then pick the most important player, I would still probably say Tayven Jackson, because so much revolves around the quarterback in college football. But I would say Jalen Lucas can be a sort of X factor for this team, and his ability to do so many things as a return guy, as a running back, as a slot receiver, however they end up using him, however creative they get with using him, the ball just needs to get in his hands more. He only had 65 touches on offense last season. You need to double that at the very least, I think, this next season. And so he's going to be an important piece of this team. And if IU's going to surpass 4 or 5 wins, it's going to be because he had a really big season, I think. So he's certainly an X factor for this team heading into this fall.
100%. I mean, I'm very excited to watch him because of the fact that he was really electric last year and definitely has the potential to be, like you said, an X factor, and the usage going way up. Definitely needs to be doubled for Indiana next year. Hopefully, he can stay healthy as well. They need to put him in spots where he's not going to get injured as well. Now, the other side of the ball, the defense for Indiana was slightly disappointing last year, because of the fact that Tom Allen was calling the plays. And I think a lot of people thought that it was going to work out better. You had a veteran secondary, back last year. You still had Tywan Mullen, Jalen Williams, all that. That position group underperformed last season. And overall, the defense just did not, play that well. I think part of the issue was the fact that Walt Bell was using an up-tempo offense, which Indiana got off the field very quickly on offense. So I think it hurt the defense in the long run. But do you think that, like, what position group do you think will have the most success next year on defense? And do you think in general that Indiana's defense will take a step forward this season with, Tom Allen not calling the plays anymore and, they have a new co-defensive coordinator?
Certainly hope they take a step forward because there's not many steps back left to take. I was really disappointed with the defense last season. Not only was Tom Allen taking over play calling duty, that defense had a lot of talent that was bad, disappointing. That secondary, I thought, was one of the better secondaries in the Big Ten, and they got diced up repeatedly. And so there are steps forward to be taken, but that group, going into last season, that group it was the offense that had a ton of questions. There was a lot of turnover, but the defense had largely stayed the same. It's kind of the other way around this season, in that there's been a ton of turnover on the defense, and there's a lot of questions about basically every position. I'm really interested to see the defensive line this year. Andre Carter is someone that I think fans are going to hear his name a lot this season. He was a transfer from Western Michigan, was all conference, I believe second team with Western Michigan last year. He was valued as a prospect. In our Locked On kind of group message, there were a number of guys who told me that they wanted him last season, or during the transfer portal last spring, last winter. So he was someone that was valued. I know a lot of teams were going after. It's not just him, but it's a lot of new faces. Andre Carter, Philip Bleedy from Texas Tech, Marcus Burris Jr. from Texas A&M, all have been guys that Tom Allen singled out and talked about. The defensive line hasn't been good in quite a while under Tom Allen, and he always talks about havoc plays. Havoc is a buzzword with him, and a lot of that starts with the defensive line, creating that pressure, forcing teams into decisions, and capitalizing on mistakes. If your defensive line isn't able to create that pressure, then you're giving opposing defenses time to just sit in the pocket and do whatever, or you're forcing the team to blitz and making them vulnerable on the backside. So if this defensive line that has a fair amount of talent is able to take a step forward, that changes the dynamic of the defense, and they haven't had that in a number of seasons. When Tom Allen defenses were at their best, they had really strong defensive line play. They were strong in a lot of places, but they had strong defensive line play. So it's kind of cliche that the two kind of biggest areas on offense and defense is the line, because I know that's what everybody talks about, and that's what all the talking heads and the old guys will tell you, is you have to be good in the trenches. But I mean, you've seen with IU the last couple seasons, when you're not good in the trenches, look what's happened. And so the defensive line, I think, is going to be a group that I'm going to be watching at the beginning of the season to see how they play and see how they adapt. It's going to be a lot of new faces, and that's another reason why it kind of stinks to play Ohio State at the beginning of the year, because this is a defense that is almost entirely new. I think there's only going to be about 2 or 3 guys that are going to be holdovers as starters this season. Everybody else is going to be new, and you're going to come up against an Ohio State team that is going to have a ton of talent. Now, they're going to have a new quarterback as well, but they're going to have a lot of talent. It's going to be quite a test right out of the gate. So, but defensive line is going to be the group I think I'm going to watch the most early in the year.
I mean, that makes sense. Like you said, it is a cliche, but definitely both lines of scrimmage are very important. I mean, last year, Cam Jones was like the only guy that played to expectation. At middle linebacker, he did a really solid job, filling Micah McFadden's hole that he left at that spot. And then he got hurt, and then the defense just really collapsed last season. And I mean, like you mentioned, a couple guys returning, Aaron Casey, Noah Pierre. I mean, those guys were solid. but I don't think, they have the high ceiling potential of Cam Jones or Micah McFadden, but both could be really solid this year. But yes, a lot of new faces. It's going to be really interesting with Indiana football all around to see how that, they play next year. The Ohio State game is not going to be the litmus test for sure. The games like Indiana State and Akron, Louisville, Rutgers, Purdue, Michigan State, those games are definitely going to determine whether they make a bowl game or not. But definitely, I have them going 5-7. You mentioned 4 or 5 wins as well. So, I mean, definitely that's not where Indiana fans want to be. But even if they go 5-7 and there's significant looking improvement, that would at least be a good sign moving forward for Indiana that maybe they'll be even better in 2024 with an easier schedule, with the divisions being gone and possibly a lot of the players returning for another season. So, and not a lot of transfers. So hopefully that will be the case for them. I guess, before we wrap up, you talk about Indiana baseball for really brief. I mean, they're a team that last year, they lost to Kentucky this past season, but they were really good last year. And they definitely, had a lot of success, felt that they could even beat Kentucky and go further in, the baseball tournament and everything like that. But do you think that Indiana baseball could be even better this season with I think everyone returning, and that they could possibly win the Big Ten and maybe, I don't know, challenge for a College World Series, but could go really far in the, tournament next season?
Baseball is an interesting spot as well right now. They've had a lot of guys enter the transfer portal since the season ended. I think it was over a dozen. Now, most of those guys were kind of fringe contributors at most with the team. So they will have some depth that they need to replace, but a lot of their most productive players were younger, were underclassmen, were even freshmen. So there's a lot of room for optimism for this team moving forward. And there's going to be question marks. Pitching was the biggest question mark on this team, and I think in some regards proved to be what cost this team the most at the end of the season. They played well against a good Kentucky team. I mean, they stole a game against them to start off the tournament. So it's a shame they won't be able to play Kentucky next season, but it's a team trending in the right direction. As with a lot of programs at IU right now, it's a team trending in the right direction. They have a lot of pieces coming back, but progress isn't always linear. It's not always a straight line up, and that's the challenge that the baseball team and a number of these programs are going to have to face, is to make progress linear and make it continue to go forward. Because just because you have a bunch of young guys and we're good this season doesn't mean you're guaranteed to be good next season. So there's room for optimism, and there's excitement around the program, and those are things that haven't been there in the last couple of seasons. But there's still questions, and they still have some holes to fill. But I'm excited to see what this program is going to look like, because they were right there again in the Big Ten and kind of coughed it up at the end of the regular season, or they would be at least a share of Big Ten champions. Hopefully that motivates them to head into this season looking to win the Big Ten title once again.
Yeah, it's crazy you mentioned the transfer portal, because I did notice like a lot of their main, the contributors, the guys that were really solid last season were back. So, I mean, it's crazy, sometimes losing that bench depth can be very important, that you don't really think about it. But yeah, definitely Indiana baseball looks like they might have some success, next season for sure. But is there any other programs, like you mentioned that there's other programs trending up for Indiana? Is there any other, I guess you would say sports teams with the Hoosiers that are going to possibly have some great seasons next year?
I mean, women's basketball obviously is going to be, fantastic. They're going to be competing for a Big Ten title once again this season, and going to be one of the top teams in the country once again. Softball was really good last season. Now they lost All-American Taryn Kern, and going to be really hard to replace her, but there were still other pieces to that team that were really good that are going to be around. So they're kind of trending upward. And then obviously soccer is always around, and they were in the title game and lose on a penalty shootout in heartbreaking fashion. But that's a program that routinely reloads versus rebuilding. So they're going to be a force once again almost regardless of how they perform in the regular season, and they struggled last year in the regular season, they'll get things right come tournament time, and they'll be a force once more. So it's a really exciting time, I think, right now to be an IU sports fan pretty much across the board.
Yeah, definitely. Women's basketball, Terry Morin's done an unbelievable job with that program. And you mentioned some of the others as well. Softball, that was a tough blow. I did see that she transferred. That was tough to Stanford. So definitely some ups and downs, but all around it, like you said, does look like Indiana is set up to have a really successful, I guess you would say, year in with their athletics program. It's going to be a lot of fun. Just a quick shout out to chat real quick. Jeff says that he was here earlier. Really appreciate you for stopping by. Buckeye Mike says, how's it going? Doing really well. It was definitely a blast with this interview for sure. Nana says, I'm here and looking forward to your podcast. Appreciate that. Jackson has a couple questions. He did say, quest for Jacob, what was it like seeing Indiana beat the nation's leading passer and Austin Reed when the Hoosiers won against Western Kentucky last season? That was a highlight.
It was an unexpectedly close game, but Western Kentucky had a one heck of a talented team last year, and IU was lucky to escape that game with a win.
Yeah, that was definitely a really good game. And then Jackson says as well, what's it like being the defending champs of the old brass spittoon?
My favorite trophy in college football, if only because I can't imagine a better name than the old brass spittoon. I think they were allowed to spit in it this year. They weren't allowed during the COVID season, but I think you could spit in it this season. So if nothing else, we'll take home. It's not the trophy I would prefer from a football rivalry, but it's a good consolation prize.
Yeah, it's crazy still to me thinking Indiana, Michigan State has a trophy like that. I mean, for the longest time, I didn't even know it existed. And I was like, wow, the old brass spittoon. It's like, wow, this exists. And there's a lot of people still don't even know about it. It's like, it's really cool. I mean, it's a bizarre team to have a rivalry and a trophy with. But hopefully, with the new scheduling, Indiana, Michigan State will still play very often. So we get to see that, game and, see who wins the trophy. But Indiana's been fairly successful against the Spartans lately and winning that more than they have against Purdue. But again, definitely really appreciate you for doing this interview, Jacob. It was a lot of fun for sure, talking about the Hoosiers and all the different sports teams that they have. And again, hoping that they have a lot of success this year. Where can people find you, though? Because definitely people should for sure.
Yeah, you can catch the podcast daily. We'll be going back to daily in August. We're three times next week, and then we'll go daily once again to start to get ready for football season. You can follow them at LO_Hoosiers or follow me at Jacob Rude.
Definitely, again, everybody go check out Jacob Rude over there at his social media for sure. And he does a great job over at Locked On Hoosiers, being able to tell everybody what's going on in the Hoosier world. But again, thanks so much for doing this interview with me. It was a lot of fun and really appreciate you for coming on. Thanks for being here, everybody.
Thank you.